everybody. I'm really honored to be here and speak to you again, I have to say, because 4 years ago I also was speaking to this community about climate change. And if you have been in this presentation 4 years ago, you will see that a lot of things have changed the way I look at climate change and how it relates to us. I'm actually very pleased, Matthew, that you put me into the group 3. And I must say, if I summarize my CV, I always say I have a lot of experience in life. Because this really makes me different. I started as a carpenter. I have been working in companies. I've studied. I've been in politics. I've been in all areas of society, and very few people have actually done that. And that makes you look at things in a different way. And I've been worried about climate change already when I was 25. When I was 25, we were talking about this. We were worried about population growth. And I realized already then that without making significant decisions, nothing will change. If we don't change our ethics, if we don't look at the world in a different way, nothing will change. So when I was 25, I made the decision I will never have my own children because they would contribute to population growth. They would contribute to climate change. And that's something that many of us do not want to do, actually make decisions that have an impact on our life and on the global community. So what I would like to do is I would like to talk about this topic that's relevant for you, modern climate change. I forgot my phone because I need to stopwatch so that I know where I am.
Larry, could we move the microphone a little closer, Larry?
Okay. So I would like to talk about modern climate change, not just as in its importance, not just in importance for global order. I would like to talk about it, that it is a result of global order and the changes in global order that we had over the last 200, 300 years. So it's not just something that has a relevance and is a determinant of global order. But I would like to point out that our perception of anything that we see in the world depends on the distance we have to the object. I realized this really very well when I was looking at this painting of Dali, which is displayed in the gallery in St. Petersburg in Florida. It's called The Slave Market and the Vanishing Bust of Voltaire. And when you are far away from the picture, you see clearly the bust of Voltaire in the picture. But if you move closer, then you see only the slave market. You don't see the big thing anymore that was in the picture. And I think that's a very important thing when we look at planet Earth. Are we actually able to take the distance from the planet that would actually show us the real picture? So over the last 3 years, I have more and more put myself in a very different position, and that's the position of an alien coming to planet Earth in a spaceship. And my task in this spaceship is to look at planets that are suffering, planets that have a problem, that are not stable planets, that are not healthy planets. So I'm kind of a planetary doctor. And the one thing that you do when you look at an organism is this organism should be in a homeostasis. Everything should be more or less in an equilibrium over time and not change too much. For a planet, the most important variable is the Earth, or the incoming, the energy imbalance. How much of the incoming energy that the planet gets from the sun is reflected? Is there very much stored, which means the planet is warming, or is too much energy lost, the planet is cooling? And that's something that I would measure for planet Earth, and I would expect a very, very small value. Because if the value is large, if a large amount of the energy that comes from the sun actually stays on the planet is changing. So I would expect something like 10 to the minus 10, 10 to the minus 9, that would be the energy imbalance that a healthy planet has. So we get something like 90,000 terawatts from the sun, and only a very, very small part should be staying there because of photosynthesis. The plants produce leaves. This goes eventually down to the ground, and then it turns into fossil fuels that are stored in the planet. So I measure the Earth's energy imbalance, and as being a planetary doctor, I'm shocked. Because currently the Earth's energy imbalance is not 10 to the minus 10, 10 to the minus 9. It's 10 to the minus 3. This planet is suffering to an extent that is very difficult to find anywhere else in the universe. So something has happened to this planet that we don't understand. So why is the Earth's energy imbalance has increased so dramatically, and where and in what form is the energy actually stored in the planet? That's something we need to find out. So what I actually do as an alien, I'm not looking at global order in the beginning. I look at what is this, what I'm seeing here, the climate change, and I realize it's a symptom of one single species on this planet that managed somehow to get access to a huge amount of energy, and it created a high energy pulse that is changing the Earth's energy imbalance. And we have to understand that. So to do this, I would like to really do what the normal doctor would do with the patient. Hopefully we have a baseline, we know what a healthy planet is. So we have to look at the past climate changes to understand what the baseline is. And then we can try to describe the syndrome of modern, not just climate, but also global change, because as in a normal body, if your temperature goes up in your body, it's only a symptom of something else that's going on in your body. The global change is important. And then we can make a diagnosis, and my diagnosis will in the end lead us to understand that a new economy that was introduced in the 18th century and a new global order that evolved over the 15th, 16th, 17th century really is the basis for what happened then later and created climate change. Prognosis, the doctor of course would like to know where the patient is heading, and the prognosis basically will result in us understanding that we are leaving a safe operating space that the Holocene, the last geological epoch, the last 11,000 years was for humanity, that allowed us to actually create the civilization we have today, and that we are heading into the unknown. And then the therapy. We will talk about the therapy at the end, and that will bring us back to global order, because there is something really, really important in global order that's missing to actually create the new ethics, economy, and global governance that we need to do something about all of this. So very simple. I have to point out that some of the slides may be a little bit messed up because I had to convert from Keynote to PowerPoint and we couldn't connect my computer, so there's a slight problem here. Climate change, and I think you all know that, is not weather. Just because we have a cold day somewhere doesn't mean that climate change is not happening. Climate change is a long-term shift in the statistics of weather. And it's not just the average. It's not just looking at the mean temperature changing. It's really the frequency and the magnitude of extremes that is even more important for climate change than the mean changes. The small mean changes do not really say what climate change is. And then, yes, you said, Matthew, that it's a very complex problem. But actually there is a very simple way of looking at it. Climate is basically determined by three factors. And one is the incoming radiation. If the sun gets hotter or cooler, the climate on the planet will change. The reflected radiation, so if something on the surface of the Earth changes, that changes how much of the energy is being reflected. Then the albedo is changing, and that means we get a different climate. And if the greenhouse gases in the atmosphere change, which means more energy is stored on the planet, more energy is released, depending on which way we go, we get a change in climate. If you want to actually model the physics, it's getting very complex. But understanding that these three factors are really the ones that we need to look at. Did any of those change? That's really the important question. And then climate can change from local to global. We will come back to this diagram which shows the temperature increase from 1900 to 2008 to 2012. And you can see that it's not everywhere the temperature increased. There are even areas where temperature decreased, but in other areas temperature increased a huge amount. So we have a large change from local to global scales. And then what is important for the baseline, climate can change a lot over time. What you see here is a diagram of different climate relevant parameters. The bottom one is temperature, then in the middle we have the climate forcing with the greenhouse gases, surface albedo, and then in the upper part we have some chemistry and sea level. And these are 800,000 years. What you can see over the 800,000 years that we had warm periods on the planet, and then we had cold periods again. And what is important is that the difference in temperature for these periods was in the order of 5 degrees Celsius. So 5 degrees warmer, the planet has a warm period, 5 degrees colder, it has an ice age. There's a correlation that was found really early between the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere and the temperature. And this correlation was already used by Svante Arrhenius, who was thinking about why did we have ice ages. And when he thought about it more than 100 years ago, he came up with the idea that this has to do with the amount of carbon dioxide that's stored in the atmosphere. So that was something he published in 1895, and it was accepted by everybody at that time. So it was not a knowledge that was rejected. People understood if there's more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, we get higher temperature. And it goes so far that in 2012, Francis Molina wrote a paper, and I want to read for you this quote because I think it's really interesting. He wrote, "It is largely the courageous, enterprising, and ingenious American whose brains are changing the world. Yet even the dull foreigner who burrows in the earth by the faint gleam of his miner's lamp not only supports his family and helps to feed the consuming furnaces of modern industry, but by his toil in the dirt and darkness adds to the carbon dioxide in the earth's atmosphere, so that men in generations to come shall enjoy milder breezes and live under sunnier skies." So when we read this today, we think he must be crazy. He must have been crazy. Was he crazy? Or was he living in the mindset of his time? And in the mindset of his time, we have to understand that this is the temperature over the last 2,000 years, the global temperature. When you look at the scale, the whole range is less than 1 degree Celsius. But both Arrhenius and Molina were living at a time where humanity had experienced a little ice age. It was a little bit cooler of the planet, but the little ice age was a time of peril for humanity. Everybody was saying, how can we warm this planet a little bit up so that we don't have to suffer so much? When you look in the literature, for example, in China, many people died. In Europe, there was a lot of problems with food production. Food was very uncertain because of the climate being too cold. Even in art, when you look in the European art, there's so many winter paintings that indicate that people were occupied with winter being really hard. And I just saw this article in The Guardian about this Viking runestone that wasn't really understood very well, but now it seems like they put it up as a warning for the bad winters in the 5th century were coming back. In the 9th century, they had a slightly warmer time, and they were afraid of the cold time coming back. In Scandinavia, the population went down 50% because of the cold winters. So a little bit of cooler, 0.2 degrees Celsius cooler, has an impact on humanity. 0.2 degrees Celsius warmer has an impact on humanity. And I want you to remember this, 0.2 degrees Celsius. That's what the last 2,000 years show us has a big impact. When it got a little bit warmer around 1200, the Vikings were even able to go from Norway all the way to the north coast, the east coast of the United States and live in Greenland. When it became a little bit cooler, it wasn't possible. So we have to understand 0.2, 0.3 degrees Celsius have a huge impact on humanity. So for him for Molina, it was the best we could do. Let's make this planet warmer by putting carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. But at that time, it was done by coal miners. Coal miners cannot get a lot of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. You have to find a different energy source to do that. But Molina didn't anticipate that we would learn to use oil and other things that gave us access to a huge amount of energy. So let us look at the baseline for the last 5 million years. The whole temperature change for the last 5 million years is in the range of 6 degrees Celsius. When we go to the last 800,000 years, it's in the range of 5 degrees Celsius between warm periods that are comfortable for humanity and very cold periods where humanity had really problems to survive actually as a species, because there were very few places on the planet where we could live without having air conditioning and all of those things. And then we go into the Holocene, the last 11,000 years where humanity actually evolved to a dominant global species with a civilization. And the range of temperature is only 1 degree Celsius over the whole period. And the changes in a century are on the order of 0.2 0.1 degrees Celsius, not more in a century. Very, very small changes, high stability. And when we look at this now and want to get a baseline in the form that, for example, a lab sheet that a doctor has, then we see that carbon dioxide changed in the range of 130 parts per million. That would be the normal range. Sea level 130 meters per, that's a really large amount. And the temperature 5 degrees Celsius. So I made this kind of lab sheet here, where you can see on the left side, carbon dioxide, a very small range, over 800,000 years. Methane is the next one, a small range, over 800,000 years. And even the greenhouse gas forcing, the albedo forcing, all of these are very small ranges. Temperature is 5 degrees Celsius and sea level 130 meters. So we have a correlation that 130 parts per million carbon dioxide corresponds to 5 degrees Celsius in temperature, and 130 parts per million carbon dioxide also corresponds to 130 meters in sea level. And when you go to the Holocene, we will see that all of these ranges are extremely small. A stable planet cannot have a large change in these climate-relevant variables. That's very clear from this picture. And this created a normalcy bias. A normalcy bias is, that we have a kind of a bias because in the past we had certain experiences and we cannot imagine that the future is going to be different. And our normalcy bias is from 10,000 years of developing a civilization, climate variations are small, sea level is stable. And this is really based on, when you look at these diagrams, the temperature didn't change a lot, and in the last 2,000 years it was almost stable, and the sea level was stable for 6,000 or 7,000 years, allowing humanity to move into river deltas, very flat river deltas, have all the opportunities in the river deltas to build cities, stay there permanently. It's not possible when sea level is changing a lot. You cannot live in a river delta because the coastline is moving hundreds of miles in a century. So that is something that we think is how the planet behaves. But that was very exceptional, and there is no period in geology where we find a similar stable period of the planet. We were very lucky, and it helped us to become who we are. So, with stable climate and sea level, the Holocene was a safe operating space for humanity. And we will come back to this concept of a safe operating space. Because it was now. It's no longer a safe operating space. So, the key points of this first part: baseline, during the Holocene, climate and sea level were exceptionally stable. The Holocene was a safe operating space, allowing the emergence of a dominant species. A species that really is dominating the planet today. And that's the syndrome: modern climate and global change. So we looked already at this one, the temperature is increasing. But is this really the main signal that we have for what is happening with the planet? We see that the Arctic is warming more than other areas. We can see a lot of things here, but is this really what we need to look at? So we have many, many diagrams that show us that something is changing. And when we look at those diagrams over the last 100, 150 years, we don't really see the full picture. So I want to give you two examples. Global temperature and the Arctic summer ice extent, to show you that the current variations compared to the baseline are extreme. So we have an extreme increase of the temperature over the last 100 years. We have an extreme decrease of the sea ice cover in the Arctic over the last 100 years. And basically all of those parameters, when you compare them to the longer time interval, you will see that the last 100 years were very, very exceptional. And that means that when we look at the lab sheet, and we get the result back from the climate observing system, we see that we are outside of the normal range almost everywhere. And when I go to the doctor and they take a blood sample, next week I have to go and get the results for a blood sample that was taken last week, I do hope that I'm in the normal range for all my parameters and not looking like this planet. Because this planet is outside the normal range in almost everything, except temperature. We are at the upper end. Except sea level, we are almost not seeing a change. So the question is, why is global temperature not changing when everything else is changing? We have to look into this. One one thing that I find very important is that we really understand how much the carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases are increasing. You can see this, we see this from 1950 here, 1960 to today, for both carbon dioxide and methane. But we have to understand that over the last 20,000 years after the last ice age, until the beginning of the Holocene, the increase was on the order of 90 parts per million, from 180 to 270. And then at the beginning of the industrialization, it was 280 parts per million. Today, it's much higher. I made a kind of a joke by looking at my life in terms of carbon dioxide. I was born at 312 parts per million. I started as a carpenter at 320, university 331, got my Ph.D. at 350 parts per million, and got married, and then today we are at 412. So you can look at the lifetime. My age in carbon dioxide increase is 100 parts per million. When you compare this, that the increase over the last 20,000 years before industrialization was only 120 parts per million, you see that the increase in my lifetime was 250 times faster than through the Holocene, which was our important safe operating space. And another thing in this diagram where we see the 800,000 years of carbon dioxide again, a small range, 130 parts per million, we are almost as much away from the temperature that we like, towards the hotter end, as the ice ages were away towards the cooler end. So why don't we feel today that we have a very much different planet? Because carbon dioxide has changed like crazy. So two questions. What did this increase of carbon dioxide do to the Earth's energy imbalance? And why do we not experience the full impact of this dramatic increase? First question. The Earth's energy imbalance, as I said, was over the 200 million years on average, 10 to the minus 10, 10 to the minus 9. And this led to the planet storing on the order of 100 to 1,000 zetajoules in fossil fuels. 200 million years it took to build up the fossil fuels. Today, humanity has changed the imbalance to 3 times 10 to the minus 3. And which really means that within 1 century, the planet is now storing the same amount of energy that it was storing over 200 million years. And it's not storing it as fossil fuels. So where is it storing it? It's not the atmosphere. Actually, the atmosphere, when we look at the atmosphere, it takes only 1% of the energy. The 1% of the energy is what we feel as global warming. Few percent go into warming up the land, few percent go into melting the ice, but most of it goes into the ocean. More than 90% actually go into the ocean. So what we really are seeing is not global warming of the atmosphere. We see global warming of the planet in terms of heating up the ocean. So we don't live in a greenhouse. We live in a pool house. I call this the pool house effect. Because, you know, we all know that if you go in a greenhouse and you close the windows and the doors, it gets hot immediately if the sun is shining. It doesn't take a long time to get too hot in the greenhouse. And we know this from the planet as well. If you live in the desert, for example, when I was living in Reno, I had to get used to very hot days and very cool nights. Even when the day was 105 or something like that, you took a sweater with you if you want to stay out for the night, because it could get cool again. This is very different if you live at the coast of the ocean, and the warm ocean mitigates the temperature changes. The days and the nights are very cool, very similar, which means we are living actually not in a greenhouse on this planet, we are living in a pool house with a huge swimming pool. And the energy that is being stored into the ocean is actually turning this pool house into a sauna. And a sauna is very different from a greenhouse. So we have to understand that. That is the reason why we don't feel what is happening right now with the planet. I've seen estimates, if all the energy that is stored in the ocean would have been stored in the atmosphere, we would have a global mean temperature not of 16 degrees Celsius, but 55 degrees Celsius. and human beings would only be able to live outside at the pole areas. The rest of the planet would not be inhabitable for human beings. Luckily, we have a pool. We are not living in a greenhouse. I think that's a very important outcome of what I'm saying here. The volumetric heat capacity of water compared to air is 3,300 times larger than air. And that means all the energy goes into the ocean. The danger is that even if we stop carbon emissions today, the planet, the energy imbalance is still there, and the pool house will still continue to warm until a long, long time into the future. So what about modern global change? I've only talked about climate change, but the syndrome is much larger than climate change. So there is a planetary physiology, and the planet is a life support system for many species. So as the alien that I've introduced in the beginning, I'm not looking at humans in a special way. I look at all the species, and then I ask my question, what is the relationship of a community of animals to the planet? Well, they interact with the planet through flows. They take material out, they take energy out, and then they process it and give it back to the planet. The amount of flows, the limitations in flows, determines how a community of any animal can grow or not grow on the planet, right? And then I would discover that for Homo sapiens, the flows are controlled different from the animals. They are controlled by ethical ideas the Homo sapiens have, by social norms, and by economic rules. That the economic rules come in relatively late. In the beginning, 10,000 years ago, there was no economy that was considered. It was really ethics and social norms that determined who had access to what. And then we have to understand that the flows have changed because the global order changed over the last few hundred years. We had colonization, we had consumerism, I put up words that I have problems to pronounce, and globalization. And I will come back to these things because they are very, very important in understanding what is happening. The result is the flows have accelerated in the last 200 years extremely. And when we look at this, I'm showing you this diagram, there's energy consumption, for example. In the last 100 years, energy consumption increased 1,600 times faster than throughout the Holocene, the 11,000 years. With this energy, we were able to produce food. And to produce food at an amount that allowed population to grow 350 times faster than before. We were 1.5 billion at the beginning of the century, the last century, and we added 5.5 billion in 1 century because we had access to energy. Without access to energy and technology, it would not have been possible. So the Holocene was a time of stability. The 20th and 21st century is a century of change, rapid change. We created imbalance and we created disequilibrium in the planetary system. And that makes the future very uncertain. And then we really need to understand, what I'm showing you here is a comparison, and as an alien I would do that, between the human environment and the non-human environment. And in 1900, the human environment was relatively small compared to the non-human environment. And in 2000, we have, for example, 300 million tons of humans and 700 million tons of domestic animals, compared to 100 million tons of all the other animals in the world. So we are now 90% of what's running around on this planet. In 1900, we were 10%. So we have completely changed the relationship of our environment to the other environment. We have 400 million, and some estimates are much higher, domestic dogs compared to 200,000 wolves. 600 million domestic cats compared to 40,000 lions. And then I like the last one, 20 billion chickens compared to 50 million penguins. 81% of the Earth's surface has been changed by us. And 5% of the Earth's surface are still untouched. I realize how difficult it is for me to actually remain the alien. I always say we now. I should actually say they have changed it. But the Earth's energy imbalance is the most important one for the future of the planet. So modern climate change is a symptom, like the body temperature that goes up in your body when you are sick. It's a symptom, it's not really the problem. It's not the cause. And it's a syndrome of modern global change, and that is important. However, modern climate change is increasingly causing cascading changes. So the syndrome of modern change is extended by global change, by global climate change. I don't have time and to go in all the details here, but we all know how many of the extreme weather events are now causing disasters. Increasingly, flooding is occurring in areas where it was never occurring. Hurricanes are getting stronger. They are occurring in areas where they were very uncommon. And in April and March 2019, we had 2 hurricanes hitting within months the east coast of Africa, where this has never happened in this way before, and droughts are getting worse. We all are probably aware of the wildfires increasing. What is happening in Australia right now is, for example, also causing extinction. And in accelerating extinction, and the wildfires are accelerating climate change because they put a huge amount of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. The ones that are currently burning in Australia are putting more than half of Australia's total emissions into the atmosphere. So that's really important to understand. So some are saying, are we really in the Anthropocene, the epoch of our making, or are we in the Pyrocene, where the planet hits back with fire, and the planet is burning actually? And this will probably increase. And then, of course, migration. Migration is causing a massive harm in the world. And when you see this diagram on the right, is showing how migration is increasing from 2009 to 2018, from something roughly 40 million people involuntarily migrating to more than 70 million, and estimates are that by 2030 it will be probably 200 million people who have to move somewhere, and someone has to let them in, and someone has to accommodate them, and that's an enormous challenge for global order. So, syndrome, during the last few hundred years humanity has made large and rapid planetary changes. We have accelerated existing and introduced new flows, and the system is outside of the normal range and in the dynamic transition into the post-Holocene. So, what is the diagnosis? Why is this happening? Well, we cannot understand that if we don't understand the emergence of this single species. If we don't understand why this single species was able to become the dominant species. It started actually when the Homo sapiens learned to use fire to increase food energy efficiency and reduce time needed to process food. That allowed Homo sapiens to develop a much larger brain. And I cannot go into the details, but there are really a lot of research from neuroscientists and others showing that this was a fundamental change that put us in a totally different situation from all other animals. And then there's actually a book, Catching Fire, How Cooking Made Us Humans. And then we reduced the time to need, that it was needed to obtain food, again when we made a transition to agriculture, which only was possible because climate had become stable. Before 10,000 years ago, we could not develop agriculture, even if our brain was able to do that. And then a big change came when a group, a subspecies, started to colonize the whole planet. And they had, by doing this, an increased access to material resources. It was mainly a light-skinned subspecies from Europe that did this, but they were able to really feed on the whole planet and get all the resources they needed. And then, in addition, they changed the way of looking at economy. Adam Smith published in 1776 this book about the nature of the wealth of the nations. His aim was to overcome the extreme poverty that at that time was really making many, many people suffer. And so he defined the goal of economy as the creation of human wealth. We do not worry about the planet is free, we can take whatever we want, the goal is to create human wealth. Economists have later taken this to define our economy that we know today, but they neglected that one of the things was also equality. He wanted the wealth to be distributed equally throughout the whole humanity so that everybody was lifted out of poverty. He was never about concentration. And then we had the situation that we got easy access to seemingly infinite energy combined with technology, and this really facilitated economic growth. And with this we were basically able to accumulate, and later consume. And I want to say a few words about this because I think that's really very important. But before I do this, let me compare what energy we are using as humanity today to some of the main disasters or hazards that we know in the world. Major earthquakes happen. On the bottom you see basically the recurrence of those events in years. And so it starts with 1 year, 10 years, 100 years, 1,000 years, and so on. Earthquakes, big ones, are down there that they have something like 19 joules, 10 to the power of 19 joules. Then Tambora eruption was a very big volcano eruption in 1815 that caused a huge amount of problems globally. The very large Toba eruption was 175,000 years, which almost wiped off the humanity from the planet. And then we have the 2-kilometer impactors that come on average a million years or so. And this is the energy that those events that change the planet totally have. And humanity, I put in humanity for 1 year. What energy are we using in 1 year? And when I did this late at night before a presentation somewhere in Europe, I was really afraid. Because the energy we are using is comparable to very big earthquakes happening almost all the time. Major volcano eruptions happening a few times a year. Even the super volcano eruptions happening on the order of once a year, and the big impactors coming on the order of every 20 years. We can imagine that this must change the global planet totally. If we are using so much energy, this must have an impact on the global planet. So I said, we are a single species cataclysm, and the Homo sapien is a cataclysmic virus in the Earth's life support system. So we are a virus. And most viruses have only one goal, to grow and multiply and multiply and multiply. And that's what we are currently doing. So the question is, and that's really my big question to all of us, can the virus transform itself into the healer? Because if we don't do that, then I don't see a very bright future for humanity. We have to understand the role of the economic model. I'm not going into the details, but Adam Smith considered the economy as an invisible hand that would basically organize things in a good way. He talked a lot about what is the basis of our economy today. But the point I want to make is increasing the flows. Increasing the flows between the life support system and us became the sole mean of economy to create new human wealth. And it became so bad that John Maynard Keynes basically said, we really need to consume more, we need to increase consumption. When you are an alien and look at this, you ask yourself, were they crazy? Did they not understand that reducing consumption would be a much better goal than increasing it? Building an economy that depends on consumption must be flawed, if that's the way. And Lebov in 1955 said, our enormously productive economy demands that we make consumption our way of life. That we convert the buying and use of goods into rituals. That we seek our spiritual satisfaction, our ego satisfaction in consumption. We need things consumed, burned up, replaced, and discarded at an ever-accelerating rate. When I look at our society, I have the impression we were very successful in doing this. This is what we do today. We make holidays into shopping days. And then 90% of what we buy ends up in the garbage within 6 months. That's exactly what is written here. And that is a way that seems to be a little bit flawed. And then in 1970, Milton Friedman came and suggested or argued that businesses do not have a social responsibility. If they do what is best for them, then the overall outcome will be best for society. And that was the basis of globalization. It allowed, without ethical considerations, to do whatever we want to do. So we got a huge amount of inequality in emissions. We got also, when you look at the total emissions, and I want you only look at the last diagram, because I'm running a little bit out of time. In 2018, the total emissions, United States was the largest in the world, almost twice as much as China in total, since the beginning, 1750. And then we have China now, the Soviet Union, Germany, United Kingdom. These are the main countries that have contributed to what is in the atmosphere. And then when you look at this diagram, the green one is showing the upper is the richest 10% of the population. It's responsible for 49, almost 50% of the emissions. And then the lower part, the 50%, is just a few percent. So we have a very large inequality in emissions. We have a very large inequality in who is actually gaining from creating human wealth. So easy access to seemingly unlimited energy allowed humans to accelerate flows in the Earth system and sustain rapid population growth. And the mainstream economic model that was introduced in the 18th century and then modified in the beginning of the 20th century really changed the global order, and that has turned basically humans into the anthropogenic cataclysmic virus. It's really the global order and the purpose of economy that did this. So, where are we heading? I mean, that's when we go to the doctor and the doctor diagnoses that we have a kind of a problem, we would like to know what is it? Where are we heading? What is the prognosis? Well, I want to make a few points here. First, the Holocene was a safe operating space for humanity. I've mentioned this before. And a group of scientists have really done a great work in identifying kind of global boundaries for this safe operating space. This includes, for example, freshwater consumption, then the flow in phosphorus and nitrogen cycle, land use changes, extinction rate, and they identified that, for example, for land use, we have crossed the boundary almost already. When you look at the cycles in terms of nitrogen and phosphorus, we completely changed those cycles because we needed to produce nutrients, fertilizers, to create more and more human beings that could be sustained. And it also created a huge amount of dead zones in the ocean. It has many, many impacts. We have crossed this boundary by far. We also have crossed the boundary in terms of extinction rates, and that triggered, for example, some of the people to say, or some of the scientists to say, we are actually the asteroid. It's not the asteroid anymore that is causing extinction, it's humanity that is causing extinction. And we have, of course, changed the carbon cycle, and that leads to climate change. The other thing that it's probably going to do, and this is another paper by Rothman et al. When I read it, I got really a little bit afraid because he basically showed that we might put too much carbon into the ocean and then life in the ocean will stop to exist. And then he made estimates, when is this going to happen? And his estimate is 2100 plus minus 50 years. So in his estimate, it could already happen by 2050, that we have a planet where no life in the ocean is anymore existing. And I think that's something I feel very bad about the world we are leaving for future generations, if that is what might happen. And we see already outcomes, for example, of problems that come back to us. You may have heard about the Sargasso problem that's causing a huge amount of economic impacts on tourism in the Caribbean and in other areas. All of this is a result of us re-engineering the planet. So, and then of course we introduce a huge amount of new novelties. One of the things that we are getting increasingly aware of is plastic. That is causing a huge amount of problems, and I don't have time to go into the details. But when we look at the prognosis in our nice lab sheet, this is where we are heading. We are not going back into the normal range. We are going rapidly, within a few decades, very far away from the normal range. And we cannot expect that the planet is going to behave in the way it has behaved in the past. It will be a very, very different planet. And the one thing that's very important for me is we have to show the things so that people can understand them. This is a diagram that the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change under the United Nations Framework Convention for Climate Change has been showing from 1950, the temperature went up a little bit, and then there are these projections for the future. This doesn't look dramatic. This looks, a little bit increase, cannot be very bad. But when you compare it to the last 10,000 years, the area within the blue lines is what we know. And we are heading somewhere up there, a totally different planet. A really totally different planet, and humanity has to adapt to this. So it's important how we compare what is happening today to the long-term baseline. And it's the same for the doctor. If the doctor only looks at your increase of your body temperature since yesterday, when you already had fever, then it isn't really clear how much your temperature actually changed. I think I have to jump over this year. I had a few things about sea level rise here. We have committed basically to an ice-free planet. Eventually, all the ice will melt, sea level will be 65 meters higher, which means very large changes in the coastline. It also means that we have a very high risk that sea level is going to rise a lot more in this century already. The protections we build will eventually fail, and we have to slowly divest into exposed coastal areas. But that's difficult to do. We need to build mobile infrastructure. We need to clean up the coastal zone. There's a huge amount of things we have in there. And we need to understand that there will be a big economic impact of what is happening. And the cost may be very high. So the other thing is, when we are assessing risk, we see increasingly that they are not just climate change that is a risk. We see land use as one that is even more important, probably, than climate change. We are losing topsoil. We are losing the ability to do agriculture. We have extinction, and we have an extreme change in the biodiversity. So scientists are warning again and again that things are going in a bad direction, but our global order is not set up in a way to respond to this. So I have seen increasingly scientific groups coming up with the conclusion that we can no longer exclude that humanity is going extinct because of what is changing with the planet. There's a 5% risk, for example, in this catastrophic risk assessment, that by 2100 we will not have a civilization. We will be somewhere different in this planet, but not with a civilization. And then we have also the possibility that there are tipping points in the planet, and these tipping points might lead the planet to go actually to a hothouse state. And there's a lot of science that is now indicating that this actually could happen, not just because of the fires accelerating climate change, permafrost melting accelerating climate change. So there are many positive feedback loops in the system that could lead the planet to go to a hothouse state. And that would mean that we would have to depopulate everything between the latitudes 45 degrees north, 45 degrees south, and only live at the polar areas. I'm not sure we have a global order that could manage this if we would have to do that. So we are really in a very difficult situation. Then, of course, the tipping point for population. We are already exceeding the carrying capacity of the planet, and eventually this has to lead to a collapse of the population. We know this very easily. As an ecologist, you know that very easily that this is happening when communities exceed the carrying capacity. So we have to look at the full spectrum of the futures that we have. And many people don't want to do that because it's really scary. And particularly when you understand that there are only 4 types of futures, basically. There's continue. We continue what we are doing and hope this is working. We have disciplines and change a few things. Or we do fundamental transformations. We could, for example, try to do a fundamental transformation how we do economy. And what very often happens if we don't do that, collapse is the last type of the futures. So the question really is, and Jem Wendell is somebody who is saying that the collapse is unavoidable by now. And he says what deep adaptation means. Who do we want to be when we get out of the collapse? Those who survive the collapse, who do we want to be? What global order do we want to have? Who do we want to be as a society? So, prognosis. The planet is heading rapidly towards tipping points and a very different system state. What I couldn't show you is our knowledge is rapidly changing. Over the last 20 years we have learned so much. The risk is very high and foresight is needed. I know that I'm already 45 minutes, but maybe you give me another 5 minutes to do the last point, and that's really the therapy. But as an alien, having looked at the planet, having seen this prognosis, I would basically say to my home planet, beam me home. You know, because the planetary life support system is rapidly degrading, overheating. They are heading for a monospecies system where only human beings and their domestic animals are around. A few humans keep accumulating wealth, very few. We have only 2,500 billionaires in the world. And while they are destroying the life support system of the planet, human system knowledge is increasing. We have all the knowledge. We know what is happening. It's not like we don't know. And for the first time, we can see what we need to change. When we don't do it. In 2000, I published this diagram of the cockpit of planet Earth and showed all the panels we have. And I said, this is not a good cockpit. The pilots of planet Earth, our political leaders, don't really know what to do from this cockpit. So I've been working over the last 20 years to improve this cockpit so that they actually can see what is happening. But then humans discount the future. We have an economic system where we constantly discount the future. We leave costs for the future. We don't want to pay for things today. They don't have a design plan. We have no plan where we want to take this planet. We are not working together in a global discussion, where do we actually want to take this planet? And there is no planetary governance. There is no pilot on this spaceship Earth that actually could take us to a desirable future for Homo sapiens. So that's something where I say, maybe I should leave, but before we leave, a recommendation. And that is the therapy, a new ethic, economy, and global governance. In 2014, I wrote this paper, the start of a new decade of making it right. Because I was really positive, because humanity the United Nations had just agreed on the Agenda 2030 for Sustainable Development with 17 Sustainable Development Goals covering everything that would be necessary to go. We had the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction. We had the Paris Agreement. And all countries supported this, except a few despots. North Korea, Venezuela, United States. So all the others are working together to bring us to a better future. But when you really do an analysis, then you realize that most of the Sustainable Development Goals are focusing on the social fabric. Very few are focusing on the economy that links us to the Earth's life support system. And even only the 3 down there are focusing on the Earth's life support system. So safeguarding the Earth's life support system is not the main thing. So what we can say is Homo sapiens was an exceptional success story. Okay. But the question really is, can we continue this? And there are many people who have been writing about this. There's a huge amount of literature. Edward O. Wilson, for example, said we need to leave half of the planet to all the other animals. We need to have prosperity without growth. We need to look at the different possible futures. And many of you may have seen the movie The Road. When I see the wildfires in Australia, then it reminds me of what is being shown as a very dystopic future in The Road. And then deep adaptation, because collapse may come. We have science-based warnings to humanity. The last warning 2 years ago was signed by 16,000 scientists. A warning to humanity, if you continue to go down the road you are going today, we will have a collapse. We have to change this. And we have to prepare for the time after what might be happening. So is the success story of Homo sapiens going to continue? And that's my idea about the therapy. First of all, we need to understand the importance of flows. And the strategy for sustainability is to consume nature's flows while conserving the stocks. So we should not be taking anything where we reduce the stocks in the environment, which is an enormous consequence for us, conserving the natural capital. Increase society stock, human resources, civil institutions, and limit the flows of material and energy. This is directly opposite to what we are currently doing. Not to consume more. We need to consume less. And we need to build an economy that can live with consume less. And we have to understand, and again, now I'm the alien again, If you look at a planetary system, if there's one species that is no longer controlled by other forces and can grow unlimited, this species eventually will destroy its own environment unless it learns self-limitation. Humanity has not learned self-limitation. And if we don't, I think we have no chance to actually get through it. There's a nice book by Travis Reeder, A Small Family Ethics, The Morality of Procreation in the Times of Climate Change. And he showed very clearly that if we want to be ethical, we can only have one child in a family on average. We cannot have 2 children anymore. Then it's not saying that, he's not saying that we should have laws or something like that. He's saying we need to change the morality of procreation. It has to be amoral to have many children. And we need to limit the wealth creation and the accumulation of wealth. And that brings me to the last few slides, so I'm really coming to the end now. Importance of the mainstream economic model. We started with this one. Purpose of economy is to increase human wealth. Earth and its nature wealth is basically infinite. In the 1960s, 70s, it became clear that this may not be the best way of looking at the planet. So we got this idea of sustainable development, that is a development that meets our needs while not compromising the possibility of future generations to do the same. And then in 2013, we got this publication that said, sustainable development is a development that meets the needs of the present while safeguarding Earth's life support system on which the welfare of current and future generations depends. When you look at this, humanity embedded in the planetary system, the link between us and the planetary system is economy. It doesn't matter whether I take a tree out of a forest to make a table, or whether I go somewhere as a tourist. But whatever we do, it always is economy. In our society today, economy is the link between us and the planet. And that means that we need to have an economy. My message as an alien to humanity is you need an economy that meets the needs of the present while safeguarding Earth's life support system. So we have to make safeguarding the Earth's life support system not just a part of economy, we have to make it purpose of economy. Economy is not to make a few people very rich. Economy is to safeguard this planetary life support system on which we all depend. And this is maybe something for the discussion. What global order is needed to transform the purpose of economy? Maybe you know more about this than I do, but right now I'm not sure how to do this. We have a lot of things that have been done with the Sustainable Development Goals and all of this, but when we really try to understand what is the global order today, who is ruling the planet, I think this work by Bernd Hamm, he is a professor in Trier in Germany, and has been looking into who is actually governing the planet. And he identified basically a global ruling class emerging, approximately 350 of the 2,500 billionaires that are really controlling what is happening. And he also said, on the other side, a strategy of tension is used to compress the population into conformity, and the real revolution is that what extent factual policy escapes any attempt to democratic control. I think we see a little bit of this happening in the United States today, that we have people who are in power who disrespect the courts, who disrespect the laws, and this I think is a very important aspect that we need to consider. And then, and that's almost the last slide, what you see here is the plan of the United States and the world to increase oil over the next 10 years. And you see that compared to the rest of the world, the United States wants to increase use of fossil fuels as fast as possible over the next 10 years. And that means they want to capitalize on the fossil fuels as fast as possible because they know that maybe by 2030 nobody will allow them to do that anymore. So we have a situation where the ruling class is deciding something that's good for them, giving them more wealth, but it's almost deadly for the rest of the world. And so that's basically my last slide, and now I will leave. But I leave for you, oops, this overview. The therapy, I think, is changing the purpose of economy, and that's a fundamental transformation. How do we do that? Is probably the thing that we need to do if we want to survive as a species on this planet and as a civilization. Thank you very much.
On the environment.
Can you say that again?
What was your reaction to Pope Francis's encyclical Laudato Si on the environment, and care for the environment?
Well, I'm not sure whether I totally followed exactly what he said, but the few things I read were basically indicating that we have an ethical responsibility, we have a responsibility to take care of the environment, we cannot just misuse it. I saw one article discussing that it could be declared to be a sin. I'm not sure whether that is something that he's really following up on, but I think it's, I think the role of religion in general is extremely important. If we want to change morality, it has to come from the religious leaders. It doesn't come from the political leaders. And I think so the question, what religions are saying to what is happening today, the injustice in the world, the climate change, the extinction of animals, all of this, I think it's very, very important. So if everybody would work in his or her own religion to get these religions to express that there is an ethical need, there is a religious need to take care of our environment, to be more focused on injustice, and even the injustice between us and animals. I didn't have time to talk about this, but there's a huge amount of injustice that we have between us and the animals. I mean, yes, in Australia, for example, 26 or 27 people died, but the estimate it was 1 billion animals. So we have a kind of a responsibility, and the religions are the ones that actually need to focus on this responsibility. So I'm very positive about Pope Francis to go in this direction.
One of the arguments the deniers use is that there have been earlier periods of warming, I think associated with higher CO2 levels. I think one of your slides showed that. What caused those earlier peaks in CO2?
Well, the Earth system has a lot of positive feedback loops, where, you know, for example, when somewhere ice melts, for example, if ice melts on the Arctic Ocean, then sunlight can come into the Arctic Ocean and warm the ocean. If there's ice, this doesn't happen. And so then the permafrost can melt or cannot melt. And so there are mechanisms that can put carbon dioxide or can change the flow of carbon dioxide in the Earth system. It doesn't need to have humanity. But all these changes are very, very slow. Very, very small, except for very large volcano eruptions. When we had periods in the past where we had very large volcano eruptions, carbon dioxide went much higher and the planet became much warmer. What is happening now is that we have a high energy pulse that we have created, and that is changing the planet much, much faster than anything before. So this is why it was so important for me that you understand that the small changes over the last 1,000 years or 2,000 years of 0.2 degrees, 0.3 degrees Celsius had already a very big impact on humanity. So now we can imagine that 2 degrees Celsius, 10 times more, must have a very big impact. And what if it's 6 degrees Celsius? What if it is even more? This one risk assessment said that we might have 6 degrees Celsius by 2100, and the probability is 5%. And if 6 degrees happens, we are not able to survive as a civilization. Even our infrastructure, our bridges, our railroads, our houses, they will not be able to function in 6 degrees Celsius warmer world. You know, we will lose everything we have built over the past because of this change. And I think we do not fully understand the impact of that and the difference between the non-human variability of climate and the human-introduced variability. It's 10 to 100 times larger, some estimates 200 times larger.
So the big difference is the pace of change.
Yes.
Compared to the past.
Yes.
Doctor, would you please comment on some of the new technology that is now virtually on the market or will shortly be here concerning much, much more efficient sun panels than what they are now. The present sun panel only takes about 8% of the total available energy from the sun in the form of the visible light spectrum. It only operates 10 to 12 hours a day. When new panels out using a metalloid of silicon, which are able to take the energy of particles as well as just the 8% or so that's stored in the visible light spectrum. These particles, some 30 or 40 of them, the number increases each year when they identify yet another one. These particles pass through us, and because we're mostly empty space down at the lower than molecular level. So they don't interact with us. But there is now a metalloid of silicon available from cheap beach sand that will absorb much of this particle energy as well. Instead of a typical photovoltaic cell out there now of half a volt, it's about 3.5 inches square, we can get 14 volts from this new type of cell, which is much cheaper to produce than the rare earth technology that we have presently used, a lot of which we in the United States don't have. We've got to buy it from overseas. Rare earth technology does the solar only, the visible light spectrum. Can you comment on what that might be?
You know, your question is very interesting because this is what many of us do. We focus on one small aspect of the problem. And one small aspect of the problem is that we are creating the energy that we are using based on fossil fuels. But a much larger problem is that we are using far too much energy. And we are increasing energy usage rapidly. We have been almost kind of brutal in developing technologies that made our life more comfortable without thinking about whether we could do this with less energy. I give you the example of, I'll come back to your question about the technology. I give you the example of air conditioning. We are using most of the air conditioning, we use a lot of energy to do air conditioning, and if you really try to live without air conditioning and you look at your annual budget of electricity, you see that air conditioning is very major. Termites have air conditioning without using energy. They were smarter than we were. They use geometry. They build a building, their buildings in a way that it has air conditioning because of the geometry. There's one building in Harare that was built in the same principle as the termites, a big mall, and it uses 15% of the energy it would use if it was built as a normal building using energy to do air conditioning. So we have, because we had access to energy, there was no need to be smart. We could just waste energy. It's available. And the more energy we use, the better for economy. So we have an economy that thrives on us wasting energy. So first, I think we need to think about where can we reduce energy. I think that's reducing the flows is more important than what technology we use. I agree with you that technology development may help us to postpone many of the problems we have more and more into the future until the conceptual problems we have come back and bite us. And I think that's really where I think we cannot trust technology alone. There is one technological development that I think is very, very important, because many of the problems we have on the planet is food generation. The way we do agriculture today, the way we need, when you think about that, if you do industrial agriculture, 1 unit of food requires 0.6 units of energy to produce it, and the energy comes from fossil fuels mostly. So actually we are all eating oil when we eat something, because it has been produced in this way. So there's a new development that we can create food in the laboratory, and in Finland and in Sweden they have been very successful to use a kind of hydroponic lab where you have bacteria and water creating food. I can recommend to you, in The Guardian 2 days ago, George Monbiot wrote an article and said, this may actually save humanity, because we could within 10 years completely go away from traditional agriculture, give everything back to the planet, and do our food production in a very different way. So technology is very, very important, but I think we need to think about the right technology and the right concepts in combination with the technology. Just using more solar panels to create more energy and waste more energy because we don't think about how we could do it differently is not enough. And having more and more energy is also creating problems. We understand, for example, now, I didn't mention that, but we are losing insects very, very rapidly. The pollinators are going away, or they are going extinct. And we understand now it's not just pesticide, it's light pollution. That we lit up every city in the world now, all day and night. I mean, when I live in Colonial Place, you can read the newspaper outside no matter what the time is, because everybody has light on. I mean, yes, we know that having light is a little bit more secure in terms of crime, but do we really have to have light everywhere? So the light pollution creates more energy that we need to have, but it also kills off the insects. So I think we need to really be more thoroughly looking at the whole system and not just looking at one small aspect when we talk about technology. Does that answer your question?
Well, for one thing, the sun is free. It's not going to help the economy by going on sun production using the new panels, because now you're not taking coal, not using it. You don't need to. You don't need all these transmission lines and huge substations and everything else.
I fully support what you say. And actually, I worked for the government in St. Vincent and the Grenadines because I wanted to know what energy concept should they develop. And we said, let's look at the public service of energy, not just from fossil fuels and others, but all the other sustainable development goals. How can we build an energy system that helps us to reduce poverty, increase gender equality, maybe education, and all of those things? We looked at all the different fossil fuels, geothermal, and solar, and it became clear only solar is a way of organizing a society where, for example, you can give microloans to houses so that they can participate in building the energy system. You can have a quota where women get more microloans than the men. Then you do something about gender equality. You can increase education on the islands by having local people managing this. If you come with geothermal or fossil fuels, you need a multinational company. Doesn't do anything for the island. So I fully agree with you that we need to go not just to solar energy, we need to basically go to a hydrogen society where we use hydrogen as the carrier of energy. So we use solar energy to split water into oxygen and hydrogen. We use wind energy. And we have by now a new paint for our houses that actually takes humidity from the atmosphere, splits it up into hydrogen and oxygen, so our houses can produce hydrogen. We can build, we have all the technology, but we have a ruling class, a global ruling class, that makes money with selling fossil fuels. And they will only stop selling fossil fuels until they all are sold, unless somebody else stops them. So I fully agree with you that solar energy is very, very important. We need to think about the technologies, we need to think about the concepts, but we also need to think about the governance, the global order that is actually keeping us from doing this. There are countries who have gone to hydrogen, to a large extent. Portugal is an example, where you can drive a hydrogen car all over the country. There are always places where you can upload hydrogen into your car, but other countries don't do that. And maybe the United States will be the last one to do that, until all the oil is being sold. Sorry.
Peter, I want to try to ascertain, forgive me, exactly how radical you are. Are we talking about a post-capitalist society, post-growth society, or can we get to where we need to be via something a little bit more democratic, a social democracy? Are we talking about a capitalism that's entirely transformed or just restrained?
I was asked this question right after the presentation already. And I said that I do not want to use the word capitalism. Because when you compare capitalism and communism and socialism, the purpose of economy is the same. It's just about the distribution of the wealth that has been created. So the focus of the economy is always on creating human wealth. And my understanding that I have now, looking at the planet from the outside, is as long as the purpose of economy, the sole purpose of economy is to create human wealth, we will not see a transformation. We have to redefine what economy actually is. And when you go back to some indigenous people, they had an understanding of what you take out of the environment has to be taken out in a way that you don't destroy the environment. And this means we have to safeguard the planet. And the point I'm trying to make is our relationship to the planet is controlled by our mainstream economic model. And that makes the mainstream economic model, and it's today more important even than ethics. We don't care really about the normative ethics that we claim to have when we can make money. So it's really the economy that determines how we interact with the planet. And that means we have to make it the purpose of economy to safeguard the life support system. Upton Sinclair said a long time ago, you cannot make a man understand a thing if his salary depends on not understanding the thing. So we have to make the salary of the people depend on safeguarding the planetary system. And then they will all do it. I can give you an example. I was living in the 1990s, I was living in northern Germany. And when I moved there, the farmer next to me, we had conversations, and he said, I don't care about biodiversity. I have a lot of birds, it's all the same on my field, but it doesn't matter. I'm fine. I'm using pesticides to get the weeds and whatever gone. And a few years later, German government introduced a payment for biodiversity. If a farmer could show I have higher biodiversity, they got paid, right? And 2 years later, my farmer, my neighbor, was an expert in biodiversity. He knew everything about it, and he did everything that was needed to get this payment from the government. So if you make people, if we pay people for the right thing to do, they will do the right thing. If we pay people for the wrong thing to do, they will do the wrong thing. So we have to change the purpose of economy. It's not about capitalism and socialism. I think even the more socialist countries, the social democratic countries, are not really focusing on the purpose of economy being more than just creating human wealth. I hope this makes it a little bit clearer. So I'm very radical. We need a fundamental transformation of how we are in this world.
Do you think that nuclear energy has any place in the future of sort of changing the way that we consume energy and sort of making it how we could wean ourselves off of fossil fuel and change to a more nuclear energy type of system?
But you are, well, I also had hearing problems. So you know, I'm in the same situation. Can you speak a little bit louder?
Do you think that instead of using fossil fuels, we should use nuclear energy to wean ourselves off of using so much energy from fossil fuels?
I personally think that we do not need nuclear energy. We have the technology and the ideas to go immediately to a hydrogen or solar society. When you think about, I mean, you were probably not really following this, but in the 1970s, 1973 and 4, when we had the oil crisis, the world was, you know, when we had days where no car could drive, and all of these things. Mercedes had a hydrogen car. Lockheed had a hydrogen airplane. You know, and then oil came back. And everything was forgotten and the plans were removed. We have the technology to live on this planet with many things we do without needing nuclear energy or fossil fuels. We could very rapidly change this. It's not about technology, it's about the global ruling class, and it's about what we want and how important it is for us to safeguard the planet. I don't think nuclear technology is a good one. I think that the risks associated with it are far too high. And the risk assessment, I've worked, for example, with Paul Smith, who was for a long time the main risk assessment person for the British Navy, responsible for risk assessment for the nuclear submarines. And he made very clear to me that the worst case assessments for nuclear energy are not really pointing in the direction that we should use it. And there are alternatives. And then again, I would like to make the point, reducing the flows is more important. Changing the concepts is more important than trying to do what we are doing today, just with different technologies. Does this answer you? I think you first, the red one, the red t-shirt.
So you talked a little bit earlier about the carrying capacity of Earth and that we're sort of exceeding it. So how is that determined? Have we already passed it? So how is that?
Actually, we were always very close. Since probably 5,000 years ago, we were very close to the carrying capacity. And so that humanity, and many people misunderstand what Malthus actually said. Malthus said that a population will always try to get up to the carrying capacity. This is a limitation that we all have. If there's not enough sheep, you can't have more wolves. If there's not enough whatever fish in the water, you can't have other fish that are eating those fish. So all populations are controlled by the limit in the carrying capacity. And that was the reason why we had this enormous poverty in 1750, for example, where 1 billion people, 90% of the people were living in extreme poverty, were dying. Many people were dying because of food insecurity. And then we got access to energy. And what we did with energy is we increased the carrying capacity of the planet. You know, I find this sometimes interesting to talk about things in my life. When I was 6 or 7 years old, in a small village in Germany, the richest farmer in my village had a horse. All the others were doing the plowing with the cows. Right? So I like to watch him with the horse using 3 days for plowing a certain field. Right? All based on solar energy, because the horse was eating something that solar energy produced. There was no fossil fuels involved. Today in this village, there's not everybody farmer, there's only one farmer who does all the things with tractors in one way, right? So we have converted, he increased the carrying capacity by doing this because his fields are producing much more with fertilizers that have been used, energy has been used to produce them. The question I have is, not the question, one thing is the population immediately followed the carrying capacity. That's why we could add 5.5 billion in 1 century. It took us several thousand years to get from a few million to a billion people, and then 5 billion in 1 century. So we have increased temporarily the carrying capacity. And this seems to be unsustainable. Lovelock, one of the people who have been looking in what climate change is going to do to the carrying capacity, he said, and I hope he is wrong, I really hope he is wrong. He said that by 2050 the carrying capacity will be down to 1 billion people. Which means that our children will have to decide who are the 9 out of 10 who have to go. Who's going to make this decision? Is it the global ruling class that's going to eliminate people who are too many? Or how are we doing this? So increasing the carrying capacity in an unsustainable way, and then having populations who do not self-limit. We are not different from wolves. If there are more sheep, I can have more offspring, and then we can have more sheep. You know, this is really what we need to understand. We are animals in the same way as all the other animals. We don't use our brain, we don't use our ethics, we don't use our moral norms to limit ourselves. And we follow the carrying capacity, and when the carrying capacity goes down, the population will be too big. And that will most likely lead to a social collapse. I don't think we have a global order that can handle. We have already now problems with the 70 million involuntary migrants. You can build walls to keep them out, but basically you say, I want them to die outside and not inside. And so this is really the question we need to ask ourselves. Should we limit ourselves, or should we continue to increase the carrying capacity with nuclear energy and solar energy and whatever we have until we can't do it anymore? And then we have the collapse. So I think we should use our knowledge that we have, that this cannot continue forever. We need to make changes now to avoid really the big collapse that comes later. And you had a question.
So earlier you were talking about how the ruling class is making all of the decisions. Do you think like the new groups like the Paris Accord have the power to stand up against them and change?
You're asking a question that I think we don't ask enough. What is actually controlling the global system? I would be totally wrong to say I'm an expert, right? I really don't understand this non-linear system of humanity that is able to change so rapidly from something. I do understand that a system view, looking at it from a system point of view, helps to understand much more. So the question, what are people feeling, is very important for their decision when they are voting, for example. If they have fear, if they are disappointed, then they will vote in a different direction than if they are in a safe society. We know from neuroscience, for example, that human brain normally can deal with 3 major concerns. If you have more than 3 major concerns, you have a tendency to either ignore, deny these threats, or to believe that somebody is just making it up. So this explains, for example, why a safe society that most countries in Europe present, the people have more capacity to be open for climate change and extension and all of this, while in a less secure society like the United States, where individuals have really to worry. When I came from Europe to the United States, I had to learn a lot of fears that I didn't have in Europe. I didn't have to be afraid about my retirement in Europe. I didn't have to think about health insurance. I didn't have to think about education if I had kids. All of this was free and organized by the government. Nothing was left to me. Here I had to learn all of those fears that everybody in the United States has, or should have. And then you understand why so many people here are not really open for understanding what is really going on. But that doesn't explain really how this whole system is working. I'm not saying that Bernd Hamm, who's talked about the global ruling class, has the right way of looking at it, but I think it's important to try to find out who is actually making the decisions. And there is a clear indication that those who have a huge amount of money are impacting a huge amount of decisions and what people think. The oil industry, there has been a study done showing that the oil industry spent an enormous amount of money in the last 10, 15 years to misinform society and to convince them that climate change is not happening and it's not really a problem. So we have this, but I think we would need far more, and that goes back to Matthew, we need far more scientists who actually are looking into this problem of how are we actually governing this planetary system? Is nationalism something that can help us? Do we need a global governance? The United Nations, I think, are very important. But unfortunately, a few countries are not working with the United Nations, and one of them is, of course, the United States. There are very few countries that are not joining, for example, the Biodiversity Convention, are not joining the Geneva Convention on dangerous waste, for example. And when you look at it, one country that is always among those that are not joining is the United States. And so we have to really understand this situation. I'm just beginning to look into these things. So I'm not really able to answer your question, but I think the question is very, very important and we all should try to answer it.
You're concerned about overpopulation. It is well established that when people get more money, when they become more financially stable, they tend to reduce the number of children they have. For many poor people, children are their social security net. The other ones will take care of them when they get old and whatnot. This phenomenon of a declining population is taking place in Europe to the point that it's alarming, for instance, people in Germany to some degree. It's also happening and well off in the United States. Could the answer really lie more in economic justice to see that more people have the sufficiency to live a decent life, which would then have the, if you will, unintended but beneficial effect of them having to, we don't need 15 kids. We can do 2 or 1.
Well, you know, first of all, correlations are always very dangerous to take them as a root cause. You know, just because people who have a little bit better wealth have a lower number of children doesn't mean that the wealth was the one that actually caused this. We know, for example, that education is even more important than wealth. The United Nations has a very clear estimate that if we would be able to educate 200 million people, women, not people, we would have a major impact on population growth. So education is very important. And I totally agree with you that economic justice would be very important. And then a systemic change. If I live in a country where my retirement doesn't depend on my children, I can afford not to have children, right? When I started to work as a carpenter in 1966, I knew already that when I'm going all the way down this way, there will be no children of my own needed to give me my pension. It will come from the global agreement that we have in Germany. It's called a generation contract. Those who work pay for the education of the young people, and the young people, when they work, pay for the retirement of the old people. That's a generation contract. We give them free, when we work, we give them free education. They give us free retirement. Right?
It's not a balance.
And it's balanced.
No.
It is balanced. Why do you say it's not balanced?
I think with the 1.4 reproduction rate, enough.
It depends on the level of pension, it depends on the level of education you want to get. So there are ways, you know, there are problems and you have to be very careful, but you can do it. I'm just saying that there is a difference in how this can be handled, right? And so, yeah, you were asking about, so if you change, if you change the system, if you make the system more supporting the people without the need to have more children. I mean, if I live in Malawi, for example, and I'm a tobacco farmer, right? And BAT is paying me so little that my children cannot even go to school. They have to help me in the morning to do the tobacco farming. Then I need to have more children because I need to have more people working on my field, right? So if the system is being changed and they are being paid equally to other people, then they wouldn't have the need to have these children. But the other problem is, will we be able to come to a system where everybody in the world can be at the same level without destroying the planet, if we are 7 billion? Can we have an acceptable level for everybody without tapping into the stocks of the planet, degrading the planet, or do we need less people? You know, that's really the big question. What is the carrying capacity if everybody goes to the level of not even a US citizen or a person here in the United States, but even if you take, let's say, somebody in the less developed countries, even there, if you put it on a global scale, it would be very difficult without being unsustainable.
Time for one more short one. Yes, sir.
I think we should keep in mind that prior to the 2016 election, the U.S. was a leader in many of these areas of addressing climate change and global justice and all that. And there is hope that we may return to that position in the future. Do you not agree?
I'm not sure whether I agree with the hope. Because, you know, I was one of the few people who in 2016, in January and February 2016, and March 2016 already said that Donald Trump has a very big chance to win this election. And my reasoning was, again, looking at what is happening in society. In 1996, when I started to work as a carpenter, there was an article in the New York Times about what the life will be in 2000. And the article said, in 2000 we will all be relatively rich. We will work about 20 hours a week, right? And I started working with the dream. When I was starting, I was working only 9 hours a day because he said he's only 13 years, we cannot have him 10 hours a day working. And when I was leaving as carpenter, when I was 19, we were down to 40 hours a week. The perspective was, we are going down to 30 hours, we're going down to 20 hours because of rationalization. So I grew up with the dream that I would work less and less and less in my life, right? And everybody else of my generation grew up with this dream. We thought that we are really in a progress where we get more and more in life with working less and less because of rationalization. I remember in the coffee breaks we were always talking about, how are we doing this? Are we going only to work 3 days? Or are we going to work, 3 days, 8 hours or whatever, and what are we doing with the rest of the time? And then globalization started. Friedman came and said, let's change this. It's all about shareholders. And then suddenly, the trend went in the other direction. People are working today more than in the 1960s, not less. And they get less for this in the 1960s. And that creates an enormous frustration, particularly in this generation, particularly for the white people who had a dream about going in a very different direction. And all over the world, it's not just in America. We have the same situation, and the people are increasingly disappointed about what happened, and they're increasingly voting for people who speak to this fear. And the only person in the United States who actually was speaking to this fear was Donald Trump. And if this continues, if this disappointment about our life perspective, we should really be working only a few days a week. And the only country where this is now happening is Finland. The 34-year-old prime minister, the new prime minister of Finland, just last week said, we are going to a 4-day week. 3 days is free, 4 days is enough. And she really is fighting in this direction. The country also gave everybody a base salary, so if you don't work, you have a base salary from the government. And it's working, because there is enough if there is nobody taking out all the wealth that's being created and put it into the pocket of a few billionaires. In 2018, the wealth of the 2,500 billionaires increased by 20%. Did your wealth increase in 2018 by 20%? Mine didn't. I was really working very hard. I worked 60 hours a week, but that's not enough. So I think as long as this frustration continues, we will not have a change in the leadership that really takes care of us. Okay, sorry.
Wow, what a note to end on, but thank you so much. Well, Dr. Plag, we really appreciate you taking the time to